The Galactic Council executed the human before millions, then he returned with a terrifying war cry. Part 1. The chamber was built to make one thing very clear. You were small. Whatever you were, whoever you were, the moment you stepped into the Axis chamber on Verith Prime, you understood that the universe was large and you were not. The ceiling was so high that the top of it disappeared into a kind of pale gray fog. The walls curved inward like the inside of a shell, and every surface caught sound and threw it back magnified, so that even a whisper became something that filled the whole room. 4,000,000 screens across 9 species carried the live feed. The Council had made sure of that. They always made sure of that. Lieutenant Commander Calvin Rowe stood in the center of it without a chair, without a table, without anyone beside him. He was 34 years old. Lean the way men get lean when they stop thinking about food as anything other than fuel. His hair needed cutting. His dress uniform had a small repair on the left cuff that someone had done carefully but not perfectly. He stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes forward, and he looked, to the 4,000,000 watching, like a man who had already made his peace with the room. The Council sat in a raised arc above him. 9 representatives. 9 species. Each of them old in the way that power makes things old, not in years but in the specific heaviness of too many decisions made without consequence. Councillor Vane Ross sat at the center of the arc. He was Vethery. His species was tall, angular, and built in a way that suggested geometry more than biology. His skin was the color of old pewter and his eyes were set wide and very still. He had been the one to draft the charges. He had also been the one to design the broadcast schedule. Both things were true and neither was a coincidence. The charges were read aloud by a voice that belonged to no one visible, just a voice, coming from everywhere at once. Lieutenant Commander Calvin Rowe of the human vessel Ardent Star had committed an act of deliberate interference with a Council-sanctioned pacification event. Specifically, he had broadcast the precise shelter coordinates of the surviving Draenei colony on Myra's belt to every independent signal relay in the sector. 700 Draenei had survived. The Vethery pacification fleet had arrived to find an empty site and a galaxy that now knew what the word pacification meant. The voice stopped. Vane Ross looked down at Calvin. Do you dispute these facts? No, Calvin said. His voice came back to him from every wall. No. 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 Do you offer explanation or appeal? Calvin was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man thinking. The quiet of a man who had already thought and was now simply being still. No, he said again. The Council did not deliberate for long. Later, those who studied the recording would note that the deliberation lasted less than 4 minutes. This was not because the case was simple. It was because the decision had already been made before Calvin was brought into the chamber, and the 4 minutes were theater, the same as the chamber, the same as the broadcast, the same as everything the Council did when it wanted the galaxy to learn something. The sentence was nullification. It was the Council's cleanest instrument. Not painful, or at least not visibly so. It was designed to look like the end of a signal, here and then not here, a life switched off the way you switch off a screen. It was designed to look inevitable. It was designed to look like the natural consequence of stepping outside the boundaries of what the compact permitted, which was the Council's way of saying, this is what happens when a small species forgets it is small. Vane Ross delivered the sentence in the flat, even tone of a man reading a weather report. Calvin listened. He did not go pale. He did not shake. He did not look at the cameras, though he knew they were there, knew that in a room on Earth his mother was probably watching, knew that in the diplomatic gallery above and behind him Commander Lena Marsh was sitting with her hands folded and her face still. When Vane Ross finished, Calvin spoke. He spoke without being given permission to speak, which was itself a violation of chamber protocol, and which Vane Ross chose not to address because stopping him now would look, on 4,000,000 screens, like fear. You should have checked if we stay dead, Calvin said. The chamber threw the words back. Dead. 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 Vane Ross held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, which was not something he intended to do, and which he would think about later in the specific uncomfortable way that small unintended things stay with you. The procedure was carried out in the chamber. Publicly. That was the point. Calvin Rowe stood in the center of the floor and then he was not standing there anymore. The 4,000,000 screens cut to the Council's seal. The broadcast ended. In the diplomatic gallery, Lena Marsh unfolded her hands and placed them flat on her knees. She sat like that for a long time after the chamber emptied. A junior aide came to escort her out and she looked at him in a way that made him decide to come back later. She was thinking about the last conversation she'd had with Calvin, 2 days before the trial. They had been in the small galley of the Ardent Star, and he had been eating something out of a foil pack with the focused attention of a man who had decided the food was important, which she knew meant he had already made his decision and was not going to talk about it. She had not asked him not to do it. She had asked him only one thing. "Do you know what you're starting?" He had looked at her over the foil pack, and there had been something in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. "Yeah," he said. "I know." She had nodded and left the galley and filed no report and said nothing to anyone and watched him walk into the Axis chamber 2 days later looking like a man who had somewhere else to be. On Earth, in Harlan County, a woman named Doris Rowe watched the broadcast on a screen in her kitchen. She was 61. She had a dish towel in her hands because she had been drying a cup when the broadcast started, and she had not put either of them down. When it ended, she folded the towel. She set it on the counter. She set the cup beside it. She did not cry. She had cried before, in her life, over things that deserved it. She understood the difference between grief and whatever this was, this thing sitting in her chest now, heavy and very still and not yet finished becoming what it was going to become. She went to the window. Outside, the hills were doing what they always did. Being there. Being green and old and completely indifferent to the Galactic Council, to the Compact, to Vane Ross, to Verith Prime, to 4 million screens and a chamber designed to make things feel small. She looked at the hills for a while. Then she went to put the kettle on, because her son had told her once that the only useful response to any bad situation was to do the next necessary thing, and the next necessary thing was coffee, and she intended to do it. In the Axis chamber, Vane Ross sat alone long after the others had gone. He was reading the report on the surviving Draenei. 700 of them. Alive in a shelter they should not have been able to reach. Alive because a human lieutenant commander with a borrowed signal relay and a complete disregard for the consequences had decided, alone and without authorization, that they were going to live. He thought about the words. "You should have checked if we stay dead." He had taken them for bravado. For the noise a small species makes when it is out of options. He had filed them in the category of last words, which were always dramatic and always meaningless. He was not thinking, yet, that he might be wrong about that. He would be, the Galactic Council executed the human before millions, then he returned with a terrifying war cry. Part 2. The silence lasted 6 days. Not everywhere. On most of the 9-species Compact's broadcasting channels, there was a great deal of noise, analysis, commentary, the Council's formal statements, the measured diplomatic language of species who had watched a man die on live feed and were now carefully explaining why that was fine and necessary and within the established framework of Compact law. There was plenty of that. But Earth was quiet. The Interstellar Assembly had gone into closed session within hours of the broadcast. No statements. No press availability. The official channels ran holding images and soft music that was designed to signal, "We are handling this, nothing to worry about, please remain calm." Aboard the Ardent Star, parked in a holding orbit around Verith Prime pending administrative review, Commander Lena Marsh filed no reports. This was noticed. Her direct superior sent 3 messages in the first 48 hours. She acknowledged receipt of all 3. She wrote no responses. She sat in her quarters with the door closed and a cup of cold coffee on the small desk beside her and watched the broadcast recording on her personal screen. Not the whole thing. Just the last 40 seconds. She watched it 4 times over 2 days and then she stopped, not because she had seen enough but because she had seen all of it that was going to be useful, and the rest was just the specific kind of hurt that didn't have a function. On the 3rd day, a transmission arrived from the Draenei survivors on Myra's belt. It was not addressed to the Ardent Star or to Earth's Assembly. It was addressed to Lena Marsh, personally, by name, which meant someone had done the research to know who she was and what her role had been and that she had been in the gallery when it happened. She opened it. 43 seconds of audio. No visual. The sound was something her translator struggled with, it kept offering approximations, crossing them out, trying again. The closest it arrived at was something between a morning song and a drum beat, two things that had no business being in the same sound but were. The translator's final attempt, flagged as low confidence, "We hold the name of the burning one." Lena listened to it twice. Then she flagged it as personal correspondence and put it in a folder she did not label. She did not forward it to anyone. On Earth, the closed assembly session ended on the fourth day with a joint statement that said, in essence, the Roe incident was a tragedy, humanity remained committed to the framework of the compact, and no further unilateral action of this kind would be permitted. The word tragedy was used 4 times. The word Calvin appeared 0 times. The word action appeared twice, in contexts that made it sound like a natural disaster rather than a choice a man had made clearly and deliberately in front of 4 million witnesses. There was a faction within the assembly that did not sign the statement. It was led by a retired admiral named Pete Callahan, who was 70 years old, built like something that had spent its whole life disagreeing with gravity, and who had served 3 tours in deep space during the years when deep space was still mostly fatal and largely unmapped. He had a face that looked like it had been argued with by weather for a long time and had not conceded. Callahan did not hold a press conference. He did not make statements. He went to his office on the 4th day and began making calls to people who were not currently attached to any official government function, which was a very specific list of people, and who, when he called, listened without asking why. On the 5th day, the council issued its follow-up report on the Drenai situation. The 700 survivors were classified as a humanitarian anomaly. The pacification event was listed as complete. Myra's belt was removed from the active review list and added to the closed files. The report used the phrase "in accordance with established compact doctrine" 11 times, which was 3 more times than any previous report of this type, which meant someone had felt the need to be very clear about something. On the 6th day, a signal was detected by the Ardent Stars communications officer, a young man named Derek Cole who had been on duty for 4 hours and was on his 2nd cup of coffee and who almost missed it because it was routed through 17 different relay points and arrived looking like background noise. He almost marked it as interference and moved on. Something made him look twice. Later he would not be able to say what. The encryption flag, maybe. The specific shape of the scramble. He had served under Calvin Roe for 2 years on a previous posting and he knew the man's work the way you know the handwriting of someone you've read letters from for a long time. He pulled Lena Marsh out of her quarters at 0300 hours station time. She came to the communications bay in her off-duty clothes with the specific expression of someone who had not been sleeping anyway. Derek showed her the signal on his screen without saying anything. She looked at the encryption signature. She sat down. She ran the decryption herself, which took 11 minutes because the layering was complicated in a way that was very deliberate and very characteristic, and when it resolved into 1 line of text. Told you. Lena sat with that for a moment. Derek was very quiet on the other side of the console. Log it as a ghost signal, she said. Relay interference. Close the file. Commander. Close the file, Derek. He closed the file. She took the decrypted text on a personal data chip and put it in her pocket and went back to her quarters and sat down on her bunk and held it in her hand for a while without looking at it again, because she didn't need to look at it again. She had it. She thought about the galley. The foil pack. The question she had asked. Do you know what you're starting? Yeah. I know. She had not asked him how, which had seemed like the right call at the time and now seemed obvious in retrospect. She hadn't asked because she had not been sure she wanted to know the answer, and also because, if she was honest, she had understood at some level that the answer was going to be her problem eventually. Eventually had arrived. On Earth, Doris Roe gave no interviews. Several journalists came to Hartland County in the first week, and she handled them the way she handled most things she had not invited, with a politeness that had very firm edges. She fed one of them coffee on the porch and then, when he asked her how she felt about what the compact had done, she looked at him for a long moment and said, "My son told me once that the thing about the universe is it's bigger than anyone's feelings about it. That includes mine." The journalist wrote it down and published it and the quote ran on 600 channels for 3 days and Doris Roe did not read any of it. She had things to do. On the 6th night, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was too strong because she made it too strong, always had, and she looked at the hills through the window, and she thought about her son, and she thought about the word they had used. Nullification. She turned it over in her mind. Nullification. Like he was an equation. Like he was a decision that could be reversed. Like he was a signal you could just turn off. She drank her coffee. She thought, they don't know what they turned off. She thought, they will. She was not a military woman. She was not a political woman. She was a woman who had raised a son alone in a county where alone meant something real, and who had watched that son grow into the specific kind of quiet that most people misread as surrender, and who knew, had always known, that it was not surrender. It was patience. She finished her coffee and washed the cup and dried it with the dish towel, the same one. She had kept it on the counter, for no reason she could have explained, and put it away. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the hills and the county and the planet and the pale reach of Earth's solar system, the Galactic Council was reviewing its next list. They were not thinking about Calvin Rowe. They should have been. The Galactic Council executed the human before millions, then he returned with a terrifying war cry. Part 3. 3 months after the broadcast, Calvin Rowe was eating cold rice in the cargo hold of a Drenai freighter with a cracked hull panel and deciding which problem to solve first. The hull panel was the loudest problem. It rattled when the ship hit certain speeds, and the rattle had a particular quality that suggested it was one bad patch of turbulence away from becoming a much larger and more permanent problem. The second problem was fuel, which they had enough of but not comfortably enough. The third problem was that he was supposed to be dead. Of these three, the hull panel was the most immediately solvable, so he put the rice down and went to look at it. He was in the sheer corridor, which was a long stretch of deep space that existed in a legal gray area roughly the size of several solar systems. The council governed it on paper. In practice, the corridor governed itself, which meant it was lawless in all the ways that made it dangerous and useful in equal measure. Species that had been displaced, scattered, or diminished ended up here. Every kind of ship that shouldn't technically still be flying ended up here. Every kind of person who needed to be somewhere the council wasn't looking ended up here. Calvin had ended up here. The nullification, it turned out, was survivable. Barely. Contingently. At a cost he had not yet fully calculated and was not thinking about right now, because right now there was a hull panel to look at and rice going cold in the cargo bay. He had spent the first 2 weeks after surviving it in a state of recovery that he would later describe only as unpleasant, in the flat tone he used for things that were much worse than unpleasant. The Drenai had found him. He had made arrangements in advance, because he was the kind of man who made arrangements in advance for things that had less than a 30% chance of working, which most people would not bother to plan for because most people calculated odds differently. He planned for the 30%. He planned for the 10%. He planned for scenarios that had no reasonable probability at all, because the universe had taught him, over the course of his life, that unreasonable things happen constantly and it was better to have a plan than to be surprised. He fixed the hull panel with a strip of bonding compound he found in a box that also contained 3 mismatched tools and a desiccated piece of something that might have once been food. He pressed the compound into the seam and held it for the required time and then pressed harder than required because he did not trust the compound and trusted the extra pressure. Then he went back to his rice. The Drenai on this ship were 7 in number. Their names were long and had sounds in them that Calvin could approximate but not quite replicate, so they had given him shortened versions to use, the way you give a nickname to someone who is struggling with the real thing. They were quiet people. Careful with space, careful with sound, careful with each other. They had lost so much that what remained was held very gently. They did not ask him many questions. They had asked him, once, how he survived the nullification, and he had said it was complicated and technical, and they had nodded and not asked again, which he appreciated more than he could say. What he was doing in the corridor was not, technically, building an army. He was having conversations. Every species the council had pacified, displaced, or threatened in the last 3 decades had people in the corridor. Drenai, obviously. Shorel, who were small and gray and communicated partly through a system of rapid color shifts in their outer skin. The Fun, who were aquatic and used translation rigs to breathe and speak in dry air and who looked perpetually uncomfortable in a way that turned out not to be discomfort but their natural resting expression. A dozen smaller groups with no common language and no common history except the one the council had given them, which was the experience of being on the wrong end of a pacification review. Calvin had been in the corridor for 2 months before he started talking to them. The first month was recovery. The second month was listening. He sat in the common areas of different ships and stations and he listened to what people were saying and how they were saying it, and he learned where the anger was and where the fear was and where the two things had grown together into something that was neither exactly but was made from both. He spoke 12 languages badly and 3 passably and 1, the Draenei trade dialect, well enough that the Draenei on his ship had stopped making the small polite corrections they'd been making in the first weeks. When he started talking, he said the same thing to everyone, more or less. He said, "I am the human they killed on the broadcast. I am still here. I want to know if you are tired." It was a strange opening. It did not promise anything. It did not make anything sound possible that was not possible. It just put the fact of his survival in the room and then asked a question, and the question was not really about tiredness. Everyone in the corridor was tired. The question was about what kind of tired they were, the kind that wants to rest, or the kind that has finished being tired and become something else. Most of them, it turned out, were the second kind. He built the network slowly. Not ships, not weapons, those would come later, or not, depending. What he built first was communication. A series of relay points and encrypted channels that let the scattered groups in the corridor talk to each other without going through any infrastructure the council monitored. It was not complicated technology. It was careful technology. The difference was meaningful. He called it nothing. It didn't have a name yet. The Draenei started calling it the second breath, among themselves, in their own language, and the name spread through the corridor the way names spread when they feel true, which is without anyone's permission. Lena Marsh received his second encoded transmission on a morning when she had been awake for 19 hours and had just filed her fourth and final application for medical leave, which she expected to be approved on the grounds that she looked, in her own opinion, extremely unwell. The transmission had coordinates in the sheer corridor and a time window and 2 words, "Bring people." She stared at it for a long time. Then she made a list of names. All of them people she had served with at some point. All of them veterans. All of them the kind of people who, when she called and said nothing except, "I need you, come," would understand what that meant and would not ask for more than she could give. She called 6 of them. All 6 answered. None of them asked questions she couldn't answer. She submitted her medical leave paperwork with an end date she had no intention of honoring. She packed a single bag. She did not say goodbye to anyone on the Ardent Star because she had already said goodbye to everything she was leaving behind, quietly, in private, in the way of people who understand that some departures don't get ceremonies. Eddie was already in the corridor when Lena arrived. She was 22 years old and the best pilot anyone in the sheer corridor had seen in a generation, which was a large claim and which was true. She was Shorel, which meant she was small and she shifted color when her feelings were strong, pale silver when she was thinking hard, a deep amber that was almost brown when she was angry, which was most of the time. Her family was on the drift colony the council's next review list had named. She had found Calvin in the corridor 6 weeks earlier by the straightforward method of asking every ship she encountered if they had seen a human who was supposed to be dead. She had found him on the 3rd day of asking. She had told him what she needed. He had told her what he was building. She had looked at him for a long time with that amber color bleeding into her skin and then said, in the trade dialect, a phrase that translated roughly as, "This is small and it is also the only thing." He had agreed that it was both. When Lena Marsh arrived at the rendezvous point and found her way to the cargo hold of the Draenei freighter, she saw Calvin Rowe sitting on a crate eating something out of a foil pack and looking, in her honest assessment, terrible. Thinner. Carrying something in the set of his shoulders that had not been there before. But present. Breathing. Thinking. "You look terrible," she told him. "I was executed," he said. She sat down on the crate across from him and looked at the 6 people who had come with her, who were fanning out through the hold and already beginning the process of figuring out who was there and what they were working with. "What are we doing?" she asked. He offered her the foil pack. She took it. He told her the Galactic Council executed the human before millions, then he returned with a terrifying war cry. Part 4. The Council's pacification fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Shorel Drift and found something no Council fleet had ever found. Something already there. The fleet commander, a Vetheri named Sorkane, took exactly 4 seconds to process what his sensors were showing him before he called for a full tactical assessment. 4 seconds was fast. He was a fast man, experienced, not easily surprised. He had run 11 pacification operations in his career. He had never needed to run a 12th before completing an 11th. What the sensors showed him was 11 ships. 11. Against his 47. He was not alarmed yet. 11 ships in the sheer corridor could mean pirates, scavengers, displaced colonists who had gotten confused about which stretch of space belonged to whom. None of these were threats he was unprepared for. He ordered his fleet to hold position and opened a channel. Unidentified vessels. You are in the path of a council-sanctioned operation. Identify yourselves and withdraw from this sector immediately. Failure to comply will be treated as obstruction. He waited. The channel opened on the other end. Calvin Rowe looked back at him from the screen. Sorkane had seen the broadcast. Every Vethery officer had seen the broadcast. He had watched the nullification with the same professional attention he gave all council proceedings. He had filed it in the category of concluded matters and moved on. The concluded matter was on his screen. He said nothing for 3 full seconds, which for a man of his experience was a significant pause. Calvin said, "Hello." One word. "Come." Like a man who had been waiting and was not in any hurry. Sorkane recovered. He was a professional. "You are obstructing a council-sanctioned pacification event. Withdraw your vessels immediately or face military engagement." Calvin leaned back slightly in his seat. He was on the bridge of the Drenai freighter, which looked exactly as battered as it was, mismatched panels, a communications rig that had been repaired 3 times in ways that were visible, a viewport with a small crack in the lower corner sealed with bonding compound. Eddie was beside him at the helm, pale silver with concentration, hands light on the controls. "I'm going to leave the channel open," Calvin said. "I'd recommend you do the same." Then he reached forward and did something on his console that Sorkane could not see clearly, and on every signal relay in the sector, 47 buoys that Eddie had seated over the previous 2 weeks, each broadcasting on a different frequency, each hardened against interference, the channel went live. Not just to the fleet. To everything in range. Every ship in the corridor. Every relay station. Every receiver that could pick up a signal. Vane Ross, back on Verith Prime, got the alert 7 minutes later. He was in a session on water rights disputes between 2 mid-tier compact species and he excused himself without explanation and went to a private screen and opened the feed. He saw Calvin Rowe's face. He sat down. Sorkane did not know, in that moment, how wide the broadcast had gone. He knew the channel was open. He knew there were ships in front of him that should not exist. He knew the math of 47 against 11, which was not complicated. He threatened engagement. He laid out the full framework, the Council's authority, the Compact's legal structure, the consequences for any species whose representatives participated in obstruction. He did it clearly and in the standard order, because he was a professional and because it was the right process and because he did not know what else to do with a dead man sitting on a crack panel freighter looking at him with the specific patience of someone who had already won an argument and was waiting for the other person to figure it out. Calvin let him finish. Every word of it went out on the relay. Every threat. Every reference to authority. Every careful legal phrase that was built to make the pacification doctrine sound clean and established and inevitable. When Sorkane was done, Calvin said, "The last time you killed me, you forgot something." Sorkane was quiet. "You want to ask what?" Calvin said. Sorkane did not want to ask. He asked anyway, because the silence had gone on long enough. Calvin said, in Vethery, with the pronunciation of a man who had practiced it until it sat right in his mouth, "We don't forget the names of our dead. And we don't leave them behind." Sorkane looked at his tactical display. 11 ships. He looked at his armaments report. His fleet could end those 11 ships in under 4 minutes. This was a fact. It was also, for the first time in his career, a fact that felt less useful than it should. He gave the order to prepare for engagement. He did not give the order to fire. These were different orders. The first was preparation. The second was action. Between preparation and action, there was a moment, and in that moment he opened a second channel to his intelligence officer and said, "Where is that broadcast going?" His intelligence officer told him. Sorkane sat with that information. The Shorel Drift colony was below him. 4,000 people. They had received the advance warning, of course they had, Calvin had made sure of it, and they had sheltered, and they were watching the feed on whatever receivers they had, and somewhere on 14 different species networks, the live channel was running. He looked at the 11 ships. He looked at the colony. He thought about the recordings his intelligence officer had just confirmed were seeded throughout the drift, 47 buoys, each on a different frequency, each running live, hardened against jamming, positioned so that any engagement would be captured from multiple angles simultaneously and would be outrunning any suppression attempt before it was even issued. He held position. The 6 hours that followed were the quietest 6 hours in the sheer corridor's recorded history. The Council's fleet sat at the edge of the drift. The Accord's 11 ships sat between the fleet and the colony. Nothing moved. Nobody fired. The broadcast ran continuously on 47 frequencies, carrying a live feed of the Council's fleet sitting in space, doing nothing, while a dead human and a Draenei freighter and 10 other ships that should not technically be functional sat between 47 warships and 4,000 people. On 14 species networks, people watched. They watched the Council's fleet hold position for 6 hours. They watched Sorkane's flagship sit in space, armed, capable, and still. They understood what they were seeing. Vane Ross understood it before anyone. He opened a private channel to Calvin and he did it himself, personally, which was not how Council members communicated with obstruction threats, and which was, in itself, a signal. "You know we will not stop," he said. His voice was flat and even. "You have delayed this. You have not ended it." Calvin was quiet for a moment. On the screen, Vane Ross could see the bridge of the freighter. The cracked viewport. The Shorel pilot in silver. The humans at other stations who had no business being there and were there anyway. "Yeah," Calvin said. "But now everybody knows that." He closed the channel. Vane Ross looked at his screen. On the private feed, he could see the public broadcast still running. 47 angles of his fleet, sitting in space, doing nothing. The running timestamp in the corner. 6 hours and 4 minutes. He contacted Sorkane and gave the withdrawal order. It was the first time in his career that Vane Ross had given a withdrawal order mid-operation. He gave it in the same flat tone he used for everything, because tone was a thing he controlled, and he controlled it precisely, and none of the people listening would have been able to say from the sound of his voice what the order cost him. The fleet withdrew. It was orderly and it was professional and it was broadcast on 47 frequencies for every receiver in range to see. Eddie recovered the buoys herself, flying a pattern that took 2 hours and which she ran without pause, moving from buoy to buoy in a sequence she had memorized because she had designed it. When she had all 47 she powered down to a low cruise and let herself breathe. She shifted amber. Then she shifted back to silver, because there was still work, and she was a professional, even at 22, even furious. She named her ship the Roe on the 4th day after the engagement, in the Shorel tradition of naming vessels after people who did things worth remembering. Calvin told her that was too much. She looked at him with amber skin and said nothing at all, which was the clearest possible statement. He let it go. On Earth, Pete Callahan was watching the feed on a screen in his office when the withdrawal order was broadcast. He watched the Council's fleet pull back. He watched the timestamp. He sat with it. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a set of documents he had been drafting for 6 months. They were the formal motion for human independent standing in the compact. Not under the Council's framework. Alongside it. A different kind of presence. A voice that did not require permission. He had been waiting for the right moment to file them. He filed them. The Galactic Council executed the human before millions, then he returned with a terrifying war cry. Part 5. 3 years is a long time, and no time at all. The Compact Reformation Treaty was signed on a station in the sheer corridor, because finding a planet that didn't carry someone's grief turned out to be harder than finding neutral ground in empty space. The station was not a beautiful place. It was functional and practical and smelled like recycled air and the kind of cleaning compound that is chosen for effectiveness rather than pleasantness. Several of the Council's senior members had objected to the venue on aesthetic grounds and had been outvoted, which was itself a sign of how much had changed. The treaty was long. Treaties always are, because the people who write them understand that the language is not just words, it is architecture, it is the bones of what comes next, and if you build it wrong then everything built on top of it leans and eventually falls. So the language was careful and the process was slow, and there were 11 drafts before the 12th was the one that everyone signed, and each draft represented a fight that was mostly not visible, conducted in meeting rooms and private channels and the long silences between proposals. Humanity was granted observer status with full veto rights on any pacification action. It was not a complete victory. Observer status was not the same as full membership. Veto rights applied only to pacification actions, not to the full scope of compact governance. There were people in the assembly who had wanted more and did not get it, and they were right to want more, and they were also practical enough to understand that this was the first step and not the last one, and that first steps have their own value. The Draenei were granted provisional colony rights on 3 systems in the corridor. The word provisional appeared in the treaty text 14 times, because the Council had insisted on it, and because the Draenei negotiators had allowed it, because they were a patient people and they understood that provisional, right now, meant alive, which was better than the alternative. The Shorel Drift was declared a protected zone under a new protective framework. It was the first time in the Compact's history that a protective framework had been written by a non-Council species. The lead author was a Shorel legal theorist named Vasetu, who had been working on the language of it for 2 years before the treaty negotiations even began, because Vasetu was the kind of person who started writing the answer before the question had been officially asked. Pete Callahan attended the signing. He had aged visibly in 3 years, the way people age when they have been in the middle of something large and demanding for a long time. He sat at the table and signed the document with the pen he had brought from Earth, a plain, cheap thing that he had bought at a supply station years ago and which had no significance except that he liked it, and then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the signing room for a long moment. Lena Marsh attended. She had 3 active investigations running against her in Earth's assembly databases: desertion, unauthorized military activity, something classified under a code that her lawyer had told her translated roughly as being a problem. She attended the signing in her full uniform, which was a deliberate choice, and she shook hands with Councillor Vane Ross when he offered his, which was also a deliberate choice. The handshake lasted the exact amount of time required by protocol and no longer. Eddie attended, in technical violation of 6 different compact codes governing which species representatives could be present at which treaty signings without prior clearance. Nobody enforced it. No one wanted to find out what happened when you tried to exclude the pilot who had seated 47 buoys across the Shorel Drift and made the Council's fleet blink. She stood at the back of the room in her flight suit, which was not the correct attire for a treaty signing, and she was silver all the way through, the silver of someone who is thinking very hard about something and holding it quietly. Calvin Rowe was not there. He had sent word, 3 weeks before the signing date, that he would not be attending. The word had come through Lena, short and without explanation, and Lena had passed it along without adding to it because she knew him well enough to understand that his reasons were his own and not a performance. He was in Harlan County. The drive from the nearest transit station to Doris Rowe's house was 40 minutes on a road that had needed repaving for as long as he could remember. The hills on either side were green in the way that hills in that part of the world are green, a deep, settled, old green that had been there long before anyone asked anything of it. He pulled up and sat in the car for a minute. Then he got out. Doris was on the porch. She had coffee. She had made it too strong, as always, and she had made 2 cups, which meant she had heard the car on the road before he pulled up, which was also always. He sat down in the other chair. She gave him the cup. He drank from it. Too strong. Hot. She did not ask him how he was because she was his mother and she could see how he was, and because there were things that would take years to become speakable and she understood that. They sat with the hills in front of them and the coffee in their hands and the particular quiet of 2 people who have said important things before and are now resting. After a while she said, "It's done, then." "First part," he said. She nodded. She had expected that answer. One thing about her son, he had never in his life believed that anything was finished until it was actually finished, which was sometimes maddening and was also why he was sitting on her porch instead of being a concluded matter in a council file. "You staying?" she said. "For a while." She nodded again. A bird was doing something in the yard. Neither of them looked at it but both of them heard it, and it was a normal bird doing normal bird things, and it was fine. On Verith Prime, Vane Ross submitted his resignation from the council 1 month after the treaty signing. His resignation address was brief and formal and he did not apologize for anything in it, which surprised no one, because he was not a man who used apology and was also not certain he owed one in the form most people would have wanted. He said one thing in the address that was quoted, cut, and distributed across 11 species networks for the next generation. We should have listened when he told us to check. That was all. He did not elaborate. He did not explain what he meant, because the 11 species watching all knew exactly what he meant, which was the point. The recording of the Shorel Drift standoff ran in academic institutions, military strategy programs, and diplomatic training courses for the next 40 years. Not the dramatic moments, not Calvin's words, not the 6-hour standoff, not the withdrawal. What the instructors showed, most often, was the section before any of that. The part where the Council's fleet arrived and found 11 ships already there. 4 seconds of silence before Sorkane called for a tactical assessment. That 4 seconds was what they taught. That 4 seconds was the whole lesson. Because in those 4 seconds, something the Compact had believed about itself turned out to be wrong, and you could see the wrongness of it in the way Sorkane's eyes moved on the recording, calculating a math that had always worked before and was suddenly not working. Humanity was patient, the instructors would say. That was what you missed if you only looked at the loud parts. The signal relays. The network in the corridor. The 2 months of listening before 2 months of building. The plans made for the 10% chance. The war cry was not loud. It did not need to be. The fear it created was not from volume. It was from the understanding that the humans had counted every single one of their dead, and they had been counting for a very long time, and they were not close to finished. Eddie flew the ship named Ro for 7 more years before she handed it to a Draenei pilot named Suveth who had grown up in the shelter on Myra's belt. She told him the name of the ship and why it had that name, and she told it straight, without performance, because she was Shorel and her people considered the naming of things to be a serious matter that did not benefit from decoration. Suveth flew it for 11 years after that. The whole panel on the original Draenei freighter had been repaired 4 times before the ship was finally retired, and when it was retired it was moved to the transit station in the sheer corridor where the treaty had been signed, and it sat in a docking bay that was not officially a museum but functioned as one, and people came to look at it the way people come to look at things that were part of a moment that mattered. The bonding compound on the whole panel was Calvin's patch, from the first week, and it held. On the porch in Harlan County, Calvin finished his coffee and set the cup down and looked at the hills. Doris looked at the same hills. The bird had moved on. The green was the same green it always was. The porch needed painting. It had needed painting for 2 years and would probably need it for 1 more before either of them got around to it. You did a thing, Doris said. Not a question. Yeah, Calvin said. She picked up both cups and stood up. Coffee's getting cold. She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, looking at the hills, at the old green of them, at the particular light that comes in the late afternoon when the sun is low and everything casts a long shadow and the world looks, for a moment, like it has been here forever and intends to stay. Then he got up and followed her inside.